This was Wyoming, 1889. It was not a land that wanted men. It was a land that endured them. The mountains, jagged and gray as a wolf's tooth, ripped the sky and cared nothing for the troubles of things below. Down on the plains, the wind never stopped. It did not whisper. It screamed. It came down from the north carrying ice and the memory of emptiness, flattening the prairie grass until it gave up and turned brown. Winter here was not a season. It was a siege. It lasted half the year, sometimes more, burying the world in a silence so deep it felt like the end of God's thoughts. And when the wind died, the cold settled in, a solid thing that cracked timber and split iron. At night, the only answer to the silence was the sound of the wolves. They hunted in the dark, their calls drifting over the frozen ridges, a reminder that man was meat, just like the deer. In this emptiness, Silas lived alone. His ranch was not a ranch, it was a scar. He had clawed it from the dirt himself, felling the pine and cottonwood, notching the logs until his hands bled, then bled again, then stopped bleeding and just turned to leather. The cabin was 2 rooms, barely. The wind found every crack. The mud chinking was always failing. He lived in the main room, the smaller room, the one he had built with a smoother floor. The one meant for her stayed empty. His fiancée, Eliza, had died last winter. It wasn't the cold that took her, or the wolves, or the land. It was the fever, spotted fever. The doctor in town had called it uselessly. It had burned through her in 3 days. Silas had held her hand while the heat consumed her. And then, when the heat was gone, he had held her hand while the cold set in. He buried her himself on the rise behind the cabin, using a pickaxe to break the frozen earth. The man who had hammered that grave into the ground was not the same man who had started the cabin. Grief had scoured him clean of softness. Silas stopped talking, because there was no one to talk to, and then because he forgot how. He moved like a shadow in his own home. He ate standing up, mostly jerky and cold beans. He let his beard grow thick and ragged. The cold outside had found the cold inside him, and they had made an agreement. He lived by the rifle and the axe. His only companions were the land, which he hated, and his horse, an old gray gelding named Old Bone, and the Winchester that hung over the fireplace. He was a man made of edges, hard and sharp, living a life reduced to survival. He chopped wood. He checked his trap lines. He cleaned his rifle. He stared into the fire, and he waited for the spring that, in his heart, he never expected to come again. He saw them first as 2 dark specks against the gray sheet of the afternoon. It was late November, the air already bitter, the sky threatening a blizzard that might not lift until March. He watched from his window, his hand resting on the rifle stock. Strangers were not friends out here. They were threats, or they were fools, and the land killed fools quickly. They were walking. That was the first sign of desperation. No one walked in Wyoming if they had a choice. As they drew closer, he saw it was a woman, pulling a small boy by the hand. The woman was thin, her coat far too light for the weather. She was wrapped in a faded plaid shawl that did nothing against the wind. The boy, small for his age, stumbled every few steps, half frozen, leaning into her hip for warmth. They reached his fence. The woman stopped, looked at the cabin, then at the curl of smoke rising from the chimney. She said something to the boy and pushed him gently behind her, as if to shield him. Then she lifted the wooden latch on the gate and walked toward the porch. Silas met her at the door. He did not open it all the way. He filled the space, a big man, broad in the shoulders, his eyes the color of the sky before a snowstorm. "Mister?" the woman said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't shake. "I'm looking for work. Any work." Silas looked past her at the boy, who was shivering so hard his teeth clicked. "Got no work. This ain't a hiring place." "Please," she said. "We just need shelter. Through the winter, I can cook, I can clean, mend, tend stock. I'll do anything. My name is Marion." Silas knew the name. He had been to town for salt and cartridges 2 weeks prior. The name Marion was on the lips of every gossiping man in the general store. The widow. The one who had come west with a wealthy settler on a big wagon train, only for her husband to die of cholera. And then, the rumors said, she hadn't wasted time. She'd been seen. They whispered. Coming from the tent of a married man. Henderson, a man with a powerful wife and 4 children. Marion had been cast out of the wagon train, banished for being too familiar, for tempting a good man. No one in town would take her in. A loose woman was worse than a thief. Silas looked at her. She was pretty, he supposed, under the grime and the exhaustion. But her eyes were what held him. They were not the eyes of a seductress. They were the eyes of something hunted. "I don't hold with trouble," Silas said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "And you look like trouble." "I'm not," she said. Her hands, gripping the boy's shoulder, were raw and cracked. The knuckles were red. "We won't be a burden. My boy, Tim, he's 9. He can help." "No," Silas said. The word was flat, final. He started to close the door. "Please," she whispered, and this time her voice broke. "He's cold. God, he's so cold." Silas looked again at the boy. Tim. The boy's face was a pale, bluish white. He wasn't shivering anymore. He was just swaying, his eyes half closed. Silas had seen that look before, in calves born during a late frost. It was the look of something giving up. He thought of Eliza. He thought of the fever and the cold and the small grave on the hill. He cursed, a low, bitter sound. He looked away from the woman, out at the vast, merciless snow that was beginning to fall. He was a hard man, but perhaps he was not yet a monster. "There's a cattle pen," he bit out, jerking his head. "He's about frozen." Marion didn't understand. "What?" "The cattle pen. By the barn." Silas repeated, impatient. "He's near dead. Take him in there. Get him out of the wind. There's some old blankets on a rail." Marion's shoulders sagged in relief. She grabbed the boy and half dragged him toward the small, 3-sided structure he used for his 2 oxen. Silas watched them go. He shut his door and stood in the cold darkness of his cabin. He heard the wind pick up, the first real shriek of the blizzard. He heard the lowing of the oxen as the strangers invaded their space. He put another log on the fire, the sparks flying up the chimney. He sat in his chair, the rifle across his knees. He had meant for them to stay in the pen, to huddle with the animals. It was better than freezing. But the wind was louder now. It sounded like a woman screaming. It sounded like Eliza, in the fever. He cursed again, louder this time. He grabbed his heavy coat. He found them huddled in the dirty straw. Marion had wrapped the boy in every blanket, and then wrapped herself around him, trying to give him her own warmth. The boy, Tim, was unconscious, as Silas didn't say a word. He pushed Marion aside, lifted the small, light body of the boy, and carried him toward the cabin. Marion scrambled after him, slipping on the new ice. He laid the boy on the floor by the hearth, close but not too close. "Get those wet clothes off him, all of them." Marion knelt, her frozen fingers fumbling with the boy's coat. Silas turned his back, fetching the tin kettle. He filled it with water from the bucket and hung it over the fire. "I got rules," Silas said, his back still to her. Marion was stripping off the boy's wet socks. "Anything?" "First, we don't talk about what was. I don't ask about you or him or where you came from. You don't ask about me or this place or what I do." "Yes." "Second, that room." He pointed with his chin to the closed door of Eliza's room. "You don't go in it, ever. You and the boy sleep on the floor by the fire." "We will." "Third, this ain't charity. You work, you cook, you clean this pigsty, you mend. I see you slacking. You go, blizzard or no." "I will work," she promised, her voice rough with emotion. Last, he said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were flat. There's no sentiment here. We ain't friends. We ain't family. We're just two people and a boy trapped by the snow. Come spring, when the pass is clear, you leave. Marion met his gaze. The determination was back. Come spring, we leave. Thank you. Silas grunted. He dipped a rag in the warming water and tossed it to her. Rub his feet. Get the blood moving. The boy, Tim, woke up hours later, crying and confused. Marion held him, murmuring, rocking him by the firelight. Silas sat in his chair in the shadows, cleaning his rifle, pretending not to listen. He was already regretting this. He had let the world in. The next morning, the blizzard was in full force. The world outside the windows was a churning wall of white, but inside the cabin, something was different. Silas woke before dawn, as he always did, to a strange smell. It was not the familiar, rank odor of old bacon grease and wood smoke. He sat up on his cot. Marion was already awake, moving silently in the dim light from the fire. She had found his meager supplies. There was a pot of coffee brewing, a skillet of cornmeal mush simmering, and bread. She was baking biscuits in the Dutch oven. The cabin was clean. The floor, which Silas had never done more than kick straw across, had been swept bare. His dirty plates were washed and stacked. His laundry, stiff with grime, was soaking in the wash tub. Marion looked at him, her face pale in the firelight. Good morning, mister. Silas just grunted, pulled on his boots, and went out into the storm to check on old Bone and the oxen. He stayed in the barn longer than he needed to, the smell of the warm, clean cabin clinging to him. It made him angry. It felt like a violation. It felt like she was erasing the emptiness he had worked so hard to build. But when he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, a plate of hot mush and 2 biscuits were waiting on the table. He ate. He did not say thank you. The days settled into a strange rhythm. Silas did his chores, disappearing for hours to check traps or break ice at the creek. Marion worked constantly. She was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency. She scrubbed the cabin walls until the pine scent returned. She found his mending kit and patched his shirts, the stitches small and even. She took the tough jerky he hunted and stewed it with wild onions until it was tender. The cabin, once a cold shell, started to feel like a home. It was warm. It smelled of baking soda and soap, and sometimes, faintly, of the lavender sachet she kept in her small bundle of belongings. Silas fought against it. He remained curt, speaking only when necessary. He ate the food she cooked, wore the clothes she mended, and felt the warmth from the fire she banked. But he kept his distance. He avoided looking at her. He focused on the boy. Tim was quiet, still weak, but he had a child's curiosity. Silas found himself, gruffly, showing the boy how to whittle a piece of wood, how to tie a proper knot. The boy was a safe place to put the strange, thawing feeling in his chest. Marion watched them sometimes, but she never interfered. She just worked, and at night, when the boy was asleep, she would hum. It was not a song Silas knew. It was low and sad, and it seeped through the walls of the cabin easier than the wind. One afternoon, Silas came in from the barn. Frustration etched on his face. Old Bone, his old gelding, had stepped wrong on the ice-covered creek bed. His left foreleg was swollen at the hock, and he wouldn't put weight on it. The horse was his life. Without Old Bone, he was crippled. He was sitting on a stool by the fire, angrily trying to clean mud and ice from the horse's leg, which he had tied to a rafter for lack of a proper stall. The horse was nervous, pulling against the rope, neighing in pain. "He's scared," Marion said quietly from behind him. "He's stupid," Silas spat, yanking at the leg. The horse reared. "Please," Marion said, stepping forward. "Let me." Silas scowled. What does a town woman know about horses? I grew up on a farm. Before, she said simply. She moved past him, her hands empty. She did not grab the horse. She just stood near its head, stroking its neck, murmuring to it, the same low humming sound she used for Tim. Silas watched, skeptical. The horse snorted, but its ears flickered, and it stopped pulling. "Easy now," Marion whispered. "Easy, boy." She ran her hand down its shoulder, lightly, then down the leg. She did not grab the swollen joint. She just rested her palm on it. The horse flinched, but she didn't pull away. She just kept her hand there, warm and steady, until the trembling stopped. Silas stared at her hands. They were chapped. Yes, the skin was split at the knuckles from the lye soap and the cold water, but they were not the hands he expected. They were long and slender. They moved with a practiced gentleness that was startling. He looked at his own hands, resting on his knee. They were tools. They were thick, scarred, the nails broken, the skin like bark. His hands knew how to grip an axe, how to break a horse, how to hold a rifle. Her hands knew how to soothe. She slowly began to massage the joint, her fingers working with a delicate pressure that made the horse sigh and lean into her. Silas felt a strange, tight knot in his chest. Those were not the hands of a harlot. They were not the hands of a woman who had worked fields. They were soft. They were the softest hands he had ever seen touch a suffering animal. They were hands that, despite the rumors, despite the cold and the hardship, still knew how to be kind. He stood up abruptly, the stool scraping loudly on the floor. The horse jumped. Marion flinched. "Just see to it," Silas said, his voice rougher than he intended. He grabbed his coat and went back out into the freezing wind, walking fast, walking toward the empty grave on the hill. He did not understand the feeling in his gut. It felt too much like warmth, and warmth was a betrayal. The change was not immediate. It was slow, like the thawing of a deeply frozen river. It started with the sound of the broom. Silas was used to the silence, broken only by the wind or the crackle of the fire. Now, there was the rhythmic shush-shush of straw against wood. Marion worked from the moment the sun gave its first weak light until long after it was gone. She started inside. She scrubbed the grime from the table he ate on, patched the thin curtains he had tacked over the windows, and found a way to arrange the cabin's few items so the small space felt larger. The cold, musty smell of a bachelor's cabin was replaced by the sharp scent of lye soap and, miraculously, baking. She had found his sack of flour, long ignored, and mixed it with water and salt. The result was a hardtack biscuit, but it was warm, and it was not jerky. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye. He hated it. He hated the order. He hated the smell of the baking. It reminded him of Eliza, of the life he had planned, of the warmth he had buried on the hill. He retreated, becoming harder, colder. He spent more time in the barn with Old Bone, or checking trap lines that he knew were empty. But Marion did not stop at the door. One afternoon, he saw her outside, her thin shawl wrapped tight, helping Tim stack firewood closer to the cabin. Another day, he found her struggling to reset a loose fence post near the cattle pen. The ground was frozen, and she was using a broken shovel head to chip at the ice, her face set in determination. He had stalked over, yanked the tool from her hand, and slammed the post into place with 3 brutal thrusts of his shoulder. He did not look at her. He just left her standing there and went back to the barn. They lived in a small, shared silence, a space barely 12 feet by 12 feet, and yet they built a wall between them thicker than any log. She avoided him. When he entered the cabin, she would find a task in the farthest corner, her back to him. She served his food, placing the plate on the table and moving away before he sat down. She never met his gaze. But the food was always hot. When he came in, numb with cold, stamping the blizzard from his boots, The pot would be waiting on the hearth. It was her only form of communication, a silent, stubborn offering. Silas was getting used to it. That was what scared him. He was getting used to the warmth. He was getting used to the presence of another human being breathing in the dark. He was getting used to the sound of Tim's small voice, or Marion's low, sad humming as she mended his clothes. He found himself listening for her. He found himself looking at her. He watched her hands as she kneaded dough, noticing again how, despite the rough work, they moved with a grace that did not belong in this barren land. He fought it. When she smiled, a rare, quick flash of light, usually directed at her brother, Silas would feel a tightening in his chest, an unfamiliar ache. He would turn away immediately, find fault with the woodpile, or grab his rifle and check the perimeter, his insides churning. The smile felt like a danger, a weakness he could not afford. The winter deepened, sinking its teeth into the land. The snowdrifts piled higher than the cabin windows, and the world became a white, howling prison. It was after one such storm, a 3-day blizzard that kept them all trapped inside, that Marion noticed their supply of clean water was low. The creek was a 1/4-mile walk, and the ice was thick. Silas told her to wait. He would go, but he was mending a piece of harness, a vital repair, and she was impatient with inaction. While he was in the barn, busy with the leather, she took the buckets. She thought she could be back before he noticed. She was gone for a long time, too long. Silas first felt the prickle of unease. He finished his work, his movements becoming faster, jerkier. He went to the cabin. Tim was alone, carving a piece of wood by the fire. "Where is she?" Silas demanded. "The creek," Tim said, not looking up. "For water." Silas swore, a violent, ugly sound. He grabbed his heaviest coat and plunged out the door. The temperature had dropped, the air so cold it felt like needles in his lungs. The path to the creek was obliterated by snowdrifts, some 6 feet high. He found her halfway back. She had managed to fill one bucket. The other lay on its side, the water she had hauled instantly frozen to the snow. She was on her hands and knees, trying to crawl. Her shawl was gone, lost to the wind. Her hair was frozen stiff, and her lips were a pale, bloodless blue. She had been washing clothes in the breaking ice, trying to earn her keep, and the cold had taken her. "Fool!" he snarled, but the anger was directed at the sky, at the land, at himself. She looked up at him, her eyes dull. I'm cold, Silas." It was the first time she had used his name. He didn't answer. He swept her up into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of rags and ice. He left the buckets. He carried her back, his long strides breaking through the drifts. His own body heat a furnace of rage and fear. He kicked the cabin door open. Tim scrambled out of the way, his eyes wide with terror. Silas laid Marion on her own pallet by the fire, closer than he had laid the boy. "Get wood," he ordered Tim. "More wood, now." He worked with a grim efficiency. He cut her frozen clothes from her body with his skinning knife, the blade sharp enough to sever the fabric without touching her skin. He wrapped her naked, shivering form in his own blankets, the thickest wool ones he owned, the ones he kept for himself. She was burning. The cold had turned to fire. The fever set in almost immediately, a violent, raging heat that was all the more terrifying in the frozen landscape. Silas recognized it. It was the same heat that had taken Eliza. He sat by her side. He forgot the harness. He forgot the traps. He sat. He brewed tea from the willow bark he kept for aches, forcing the bitter liquid between her cracked lips. He dipped rags in snowmelt and laid them on her forehead, but they steamed and were hot again in moments. Tim watched, silent, from the corner. The night dragged on. The blizzard returned, screaming against the logs. But inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the boy's quiet breathing, and Marion's. Her breathing was shallow, interrupted by low moans. Silas did not sleep. He sat vigil, a stubborn, angry sentinel. He would not let the fever win again. He would not let this cabin, his home, be a place where women came only to die. He sat there for 2 straight days and 2 long nights. On the second night, she began to talk. Her voice was a dry rasp, disconnected from the world. She tossed her head on the pallet, her eyes moving rapidly beneath their lids. "No," she whispered. "No, please, don't put him in. It's too cold. The water is too cold." Silas leaned closer, straining to hear over the wind. "Samuel," she cried out, her voice suddenly clear and sharp with agony. "Oh, God, Samuel, my baby, my boy." Silas froze. He stared at her face, now twisted in a grief so raw it stunned him. "The rumors, the gossips in town, the married man. It was all lies. Or, if not lies, it was a story so incomplete it was worse than a lie. This was not the guilt of a temptress. This was the primal agony of a mother. She had lost a child." He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The hard eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the hands that were so gentle. It was not the hardness of a sinner, but the armor of a survivor. The pain he had carried for Eliza felt small, simple, compared to the darkness he now heard in Marion's soul. He sat back in his chair, the new knowledge settling on him like a shroud. He felt a deep, slow-burning anger toward the people in town, the ones who had whispered, the ones who had judged her and cast her out. He felt a confusing, powerful urge to protect her, an urge that unnerved him more than the fever. He kept his vigil, but now he was not just fighting the cold, he was guarding her memory. When the fever finally broke on the 3rd morning, it left Marion as weak as a newborn. She woke to find Silas asleep in his chair, his head slumped on his chest, his rifle across his lap. The fire was roaring, and Tim was curled at the foot of her pallet, fast asleep. For several days, she drifted, too weak to move. Silas managed everything. He cooked the meager food, he fed the animals, and he tended to Tim. It was with the boy that Silas changed the most. He couldn't speak to Marion about what he had heard. He didn't have the words. The subject of her past was a locked door, and now he knew there was a monster behind it. So he turned his attention to Tim. He needed to get the boy out of the cabin. He needed a place to put his restless energy. "Boy," Silas grunted one morning, when Marion was able to sit up and sip broth, "you're soft." Tim looked at him, startled. "Come on." He took Tim to the barn. He found a sturdy piece of willow and, with his knife, began to fashion a small, rough bow. He spent hours teaching the boy how to string it, how to fletch a small arrow with a crow's feather. "You don't pull with your arm," Silas instructed, his voice gruff as he adjusted the boy's stance. "You pull with your back. You breathe out. You hold. You don't aim. You look. You look at where you want it to go, and you let go." He taught him how to set snares for rabbits. He took him to the creek and showed him how to chip a hole in the ice and set a line for the sluggish fish below. He even, one clear afternoon, put the boy on Old Bones' back, leading the old horse in a slow circle around the cabin, showing him how to hold the reins. Marion watched from the window, her heart aching with a confused mix of gratitude and terror. Silas was being kind. He was being a father to Tim, and that was the most dangerous thing in the world. She had built her life on not needing anyone, on not trusting anyone. Kindness was a weapon she didn't know how to defend against. She had seen what happened when a man showed interest. She had been cast out, accused. She could not let that happen again. She could not let herself love this hard, broken man. She could not let him love her. As she regained her strength, she redoubled her efforts to be invisible. She worked harder, kept her eyes down, and spoke only to Tim. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy with unspoken things. The fever had broken the rules. He had seen her vulnerable, and she had seen his care. The distance he had fought to maintain was gone. One night, a full week after her recovery, The tension finally snapped. A storm was moving in. Another bad one. Silas was in the barn, making a final check on the animals. The air was electric, the wind already starting to moan. Marion followed him. She stood in the doorway of the barn, a dark silhouette against the swirling snow. "You shouldn't be out," he said, not turning around. He was forking hay into Old Bone's stall. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaking, but not from the cold. Silas stopped. He turned slowly. The lantern light cast deep shadows across his face, making his eyes look like dark holes. "We ain't got nothing to talk about," he said. "Yes, we do." She stepped inside, pulling the heavy door closed against the wind. The sound of the storm was suddenly muffled. The barn almost quiet, filled only with the sound of the animals breathing and the smell of hay and cold leather. "You were kind to me," she said. "You were kind to Tim." "I did what was needed." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You did more. You sat with me. I know you heard me. When I had the fever." Silas's face hardened. He turned back to the horse. "I heard nothing." "You did," she insisted, her voice breaking. "You heard about Samuel, and you stayed." He slammed the pitchfork into the hay bale, his knuckles white. "I told you, no past. That was the rule." "But you look at me different now," she cried, the words tearing out of her. "Before, you looked at me like I was dirt, like the rumors. Now, you look at me like I'm something broken. I don't want your pity, Silas. I don't want your kindness." "Then what do you want?" he growled, turning on her. "You want me to throw you out? You want me to be the animal they say I am?" "I want—" She stopped. She was trembling. She had lived so long on nothing, on just surviving. She looked at this huge, angry, lonely man, a man as broken as she was. She saw the cabin he had built, the grave he kept, the way he taught her brother. She took a final, shuddering breath. "I'm so tired of being alone. I'm tired of being strong." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "If you can't love me for real," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind, "then just pretend you love me. Just once, just for a little while, so I can know what it feels like, to be chosen, to be wanted by someone." Silas stared at her. His whole body was rigid. He had faced blizzards, wolves, and armed men. He had buried his wife, but this request unmanned him. It was a desperation so deep it terrified him. He had no answer for it. He had no words. He looked at her mouth, her chapped lips, her eyes begging him for a lie that felt like the truth. He wanted to tell her to go. He wanted to tell her she was a fool. He wanted to push her out of the barn and back into the cold. He did none of those things. The silence stretched, filled only by the howl of the blizzard outside. He did not answer. He took one step, then another. He stood directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to see his face. He reached out, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She flinched, but did not pull away. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was brutal and desperate and raw. It tasted of the cold, of salt, and of a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. His beard was rough against her skin, his grip on her arms tight, bruising. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his heavy coat, her entire body shaking. It was not a kiss of love, or even of pretending. It was the desperate act of two people, half dead from the cold, clinging to the only other warm body in the middle of a storm, trying to steal a moment of life before the ice took them both. He broke it as violently as he had started it. He pushed her back, his breathing ragged. He stared at her, his eyes wild. "Get back to the house," he rasped. "Now!" Marion, stunned and trembling, her lips burning, turned and fled back into the snow, leaving him alone in the darkness of the barn, the taste of her on his mouth like a fresh wound. The dawn broke gray and unforgiving. The blizzard had blown itself out, leaving behind a world that looked scoured clean. But the cabin felt dirtier than it ever had. It was too small. The air was thick with the memory of the barn. Silas rose from his cot, his joints aching. He had not slept. He had sat in the dark, the taste of her, the desperation of that kiss, burning in his gut like bad whiskey. She was already awake, her back to him, feeding small sticks into the hearth. The silence was louder than the storm had been. She did not turn when she heard him move. She just continued her work, her movement stiff, mechanical. He pulled on his boots, his hands clumsy. He had broken his own rule. He had let the outside in. He had let her in. He went to the barn, his refuge. The cold air hit him, sharp as a knife, but he was sweating. The cold air outside could not touch the heat of his shame. He had been a man of iron, a man who had buried his heart on the hill with Eliza. Last night, in the hay, he had been weak. He had been just a man, starved and desperate. He hated the feeling. He hated her for making him feel it. He stayed in the barn for hours, mending tack that did not need mending, checking old Bones' leg, which was almost healed. He expected her to be gone when he returned. He hoped for it. But she was still there. She had not fled. She had scrubbed the floor until the pine boards were pale. She had mended Tim's coat. She was making bread, her movements fast and angry, punishing the dough. She would not look at him. Marion felt filthy, not from the kiss, but from the asking. She had begged him to pretend. She had used her own misery as a bargaining chip. In her mind, she was no better than the woman the gossips in town spoke of. She had offered her body, not for money, but for a shadow of affection, and she did not know which was worse. She had used her weakest part to beg for a moment of strength, and it had only left her feeling hollowed out. They existed this way for 2 days, 2 bodies in a small box, moving around each other, never touching, never speaking. The air hummed with what had happened, and what was not being said. On the 3rd day, a rider appeared. This was not a traveler. The man sat on a fine, tall black horse, not a working rancher's Mustang. He wore a coat of thick beaver fur, and his hat was clean. He stopped at Silas's fence line, looking at the small, rough cabin with a sneer. Silas came out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hand. The man dismounted, leaving the reins to trail. He was large, soft in the middle, with a face that looked both clever and cruel. "Silas," he said, his voice too loud, too friendly. "Name's Cyrus. Cyrus Vance. I own the spread north of here, the big one." "I know who you are," Silas said. "Good. Saves time." Cyrus walked closer, looking past Silas at the cabin, his eyes assessing every log, every chink of mud. "This is a hard piece of land." "Silas, a real hard piece. That creek of yours, it's the only one that runs year-round for 20 miles. "It's on my land," Silas said. "For now." Cyrus smiled, a thin, wet smile. "I'm prepared to make you an offer, a good one. $500, cash, for this homestead. You can take your horse and be in Cheyenne before the next big snow. It's not for sale." Cyrus's smile faded. "I think you misunderstand me. That wasn't an offer. That was a warning. I need that water. My cattle need it, and I mean to have it." He took a step closer. "It's a dangerous place out here. A man alone, fires start. A man could slip, hit his head. A rifle could miss fire. Accidents happen every day." Silas raised the rifle, just an inch, so the muzzle was level with Cyrus's soft belly. "You've said your piece. Get off my property." Cyrus's eyes hardened. He was not used to being told no. He was about to speak again when the cabin door opened a crack. Marion was looking out, her face pale. Cyrus froze. His gaze locked onto her. His expression shifted from anger to a slow, dawning recognition, and then to a deep, oily pleasure. "Well, I'll be," he breathed, his smile returning. But this time it was all teeth. Marion Fowler. Or is it— No, your husband died, didn't he, Marion? What is it now?" Marion's face went white. She tried to shut the door, but Silas spoke, his voice a low growl. "You know her?" "Oh, I know her," Cyrus said, his eyes still fixed on the door, devouring her. "We came west on the same train, a fine woman, very friendly, until she wasn't." He looked back at Silas, his eyes gleaming with new leverage. "She rejected me, for that fool Henderson, a married man. She has expensive tastes. And when he wouldn't leave his wife, she got difficult, caused a whole lot of trouble." He spat on the snow near Silas's boot. "So this is where she landed, in your pigsty. Tell me, Silas, what does a woman like that charge for a long winter?" Silas moved faster than a man his size should be able to. He did not shoot. He reversed the rifle, using the stock, and slammed it into Cyrus's gut. The man doubled over, all the air leaving him in a whoosh. "Get!" Silas said, his voice shaking with a rage that was colder than the air. Cyrus staggered back to his horse, choking, holding his stomach. He hauled himself into the saddle, his face purple. "You'll regret this, Silas, both of you, by the time I'm done. This whole territory will know you're betting the wagon train whore." He kicked his horse and galloped away. Silas stood there for a long time, the rifle in his hand. He did not go back inside. He turned and walked, straight past the barn, toward the fence line, his steps heavy. The confrontation shattered the fragile, terrible silence. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a target. 2 days later, Silas knew he needed salt and cartridges. He had put it off, but Cyrus's threat made it necessary. He saddled Old Bone. Marion watched him from the window. "Don't go," she said as he came in to get his coat. "I need supplies." "He'll be there, Silas. He'll be waiting." "Let him—" "Please," she begged, grabbing his arm. It was the first time she had touched him since the kiss. "It's my fault. Let me and Tim go. He'll leave you alone if we go." "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice flat. "Back to the snow? Back to freezing in a cattle pen?" He pulled his arm from her grasp. "Stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone." He rode the 10 miles to town. The settlement was barely a town, just a general store, a blacksmith, and a saloon called the Bent Horseshoe. He tied Old Bone to the rail and went to the store first, his rifle in hand. He bought his salt, his cartridges, and a small bag of candy for Tim. He could feel the eyes on him. The word was already out. When he left the store, 2 men who had been talking by the door stopped, looked at him, and walked away. He knew Cyrus would be in the saloon. He knew it was a test. If he rode out of town now, Cyrus would have won. He would be seen as the man who ran. He pushed open the swinging doors of the Bent Horseshoe. The saloon was warm and smelled of stale beer and unwashed men. Cyrus was at a back table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. Flanked by 2 rough-looking men Silas recognized as Vance's foremen. The piano player stopped. All talk died. Cyrus looked up and smiled. "Well, look who it is. The man of the house. Come for a drink. Silas, or maybe you're here to pick up a girl. Oh, wait." He laughed. "You prefer the ones you find freezing in the snow. Cheaper that way, I imagine." Silas walked toward the bar. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender. "He's deaf. Silas," Cyrus called out, his voice oily. "But I'm not— Tell us, that widow, is she as accommodating as they said? Did she beg you? I hear she begs real pretty." Silas turned, his hand empty. He looked at Cyrus. "You spoke your piece on my land. You're not going to speak it here." "I'll speak where I please," Cyrus said, standing up, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "And I say she's a whore, and you're the fool who's paying." Silas didn't wait for the gun. He crossed the room in 2 strides and hit Cyrus in the mouth. It was not a single punch. It was a storm. Silas, who had held his grief and his anger in for a year, let it all go. He hit Cyrus with a force that sent the bigger man crashing back over the table, scattering cards and glasses. The 2 foremen jumped up, but Silas was a different kind of animal. He was not a soft landowner. He was a homesteader who had fought the land and won. He kicked one man in the knee, grabbed the other by the shirt, and threw him into the bar. He turned back to Cyrus, who was spitting blood and a broken tooth. He hauled him to his feet and hit him again and again. "Stop, Silas, stop!" Marion was there. She must have followed him. She must have taken the other horse, the little mare he kept. She grabbed his arm, her face terrified. "Silas, please, you're killing him!" The saloon was dead silent, save for Cyrus's gurgling. Silas stopped, his arm raised, his fist covered in blood. He was breathing like a bellows. He looked at Marion, then at the bartender, then at the terrified faces watching him. He let go of Cyrus, who collapsed to the floor. He grabbed Marion's arm. He didn't pull gently. He dragged her toward the door. "She's my woman," Silas snarled at the silent room. "She's my woman. Any man says different. Any man looks at her wrong. He answers to me." He pushed her out the door and onto the street. He untied her horse, shoved the reins into her hand, mounted Old Bone, and they rode out of town, leaving the silence of the saloon behind them. They did not speak the whole way back. The rage was still rolling off him in waves. But it was a different rage now. It was not shame. It was protective. It was possessive. When they got to the cabin, Tim was asleep. Silas lit the lantern. Marion stood by the door, watching him. He went to the water bucket and washed the blood from his knuckles. His hands were split and raw. She came forward, taking the rag from him. Her hands were shaking. She gently, silently, began to clean the wounds. He watched her. He watched her soft hands tending to him, the hands he had seen soothe his horse. He looked at her face, pale in the lamplight. He put his hand over hers, stilling her movements. "Marion," he said. His voice was raw. She looked up. Her eyes were full of fear and a desperate, fragile hope. He didn't say anything else. He pulled her to him. He kissed her. This was not the desperate, angry kiss in the barn. This was slow. This was deliberate. This was a claim. He kissed her mouth, her jaw, her throat, and he backed her toward his cot. This time, there was no pretense. This time, there was no shame. He laid her down on his blankets. He took off his belt and his gun. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, her eyes clear. She did not beg. She did not ask. She just watched him, as if he were the only solid thing in the world. He laid down beside her and pulled the blankets over them both. He held her, and she clung to him. It was a joining of 2 broken, lonely people, finding in the dark. Cold cabin a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a silent promise, made with bodies instead of words. Later, much later, the fire was just embers. The wind was high again. Marion was pressed against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Silas," she whispered into the darkness. He grunted, half asleep. "In the morning, when the sun comes up," she whispered, her voice thick. "Please, don't leave me. Don't go back to the chair. Don't be cold again." He didn't answer. He just pulled her closer, his arm tightening around her like an iron band, and pressed his face into her hair. It was the only answer he had. The morning light was gray, for the first time since Eliza died. Silas woke and did not feel the cold hand of grief on his chest. He felt Marion, warm and solid, asleep in his arms. He felt peace. He slipped out of the cot carefully, trying not to wake her. He stirred the fire, put the coffee pot on. He turned, and she was awake, watching him. She was beautiful in the dim light, her hair undone, her face soft from sleep. He went to her. He didn't say anything. He just bent down and kissed her, a soft morning kiss. She smiled, a real slow, trusting smile. Marion. They both froze. Tim was standing by his pallet, rubbing his eyes. He was looking at Silas, at his cot, and at Marion, who was in it, her shoulders bare above the blanket. The smile vanished from Marion's face. A deep, burning flush of shame flooded her skin. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, her eyes wide with horror. Silas stood up straight. He retreated. The coldness slammed back into his eyes. He looked at the boy's confused, hurt face. He looked at Marion's shame. He felt like a monster. He had taken this woman, this widow. He had claimed her in a bar fight. He had bedded her, and now he had corrupted the boy. He had proven Cyrus right. He had destroyed the last good thing she had. I'll check the stock, he muttered, his voice thick. He grabbed his coat and his rifle. He did not look at her. He did not look at the boy. He fled the cabin, the warmth of the night turning to ash in his mouth. He had ruined everything. Marion sat, frozen, as the door slammed shut. Tim just stared at her. Marion, the boy said again, his voice small. Why were you in his bed? She burst into tears. She tried to explain, but she could not. She just cried, for the baby she had lost, for the reputation she had lost, and for the man she had just found, only to lose him to her own shame. She knew, in that moment, what she had to do. She had asked him not to leave her, but she would have to leave him. She watched him from the window. He was not checking the stock. He was splitting wood, attacking the logs with a violence that frightened her. He was punishing himself, and punishing the wood for what he had done. She knew that look. He would retreat back into his shell of ice, but the town would not forget. The men in the saloon, Cyrus, they would never let him forget. They would say he was a man who kept a fallen woman. He would be an outcast. He had stood up for her, and she had brought him nothing but ruin. She had to save him from her. While he was gone, his rage carrying him far down the fence line, she packed, it was not much, the same small bundle she had arrived with. She woke Tim, who was dozing by the fire. Get your coat, Timmy, she said, her voice hollow. Where are we going? Is Silas mad? We're going. She could not stop the tears. We have to go. It's the only way. She wrote a note on a piece of brown paper he used for lists. Her hand shook so badly she could barely form the words. I am sorry. You were kind. Do not look for us. She left it on the table, weighed down by the bag of candy he had bought for Tim. She took her brother's hand, opened the cabin door one last time, and stepped out into the unforgiving cold. He came back to the cabin when the rage was spent, when his arms ached from the axe and his body was slick with sweat despite the biting cold. The cabin was silent. The silence was a physical thing, a cold, heavy blanket that smothered the air. He saw the note first, a scrap of brown paper on the table. Beside it, untouched, was the small cloth bag of peppermint candy. I am sorry. You were kind. Do not look for us. He read the words once, then twice. He did not move. The paper was simple, the words polite. It was a rejection colder than any blizzard. She had left him. She had seen what he was, what he had done, and she had chosen the wilderness over him. The warmth of the past night, the peace he had felt waking up. It all curdled into something bitter and familiar. Emptiness. It was the old cold, the Eliza cold. But it was sharper now, laced with Marion's shame and his own. He picked up the bag of candy and, in a fit of sudden, quiet rage, threw it into the fire. He watched the cloth char and the sugar melt. The cabin reverted. It did not take long. Within a day, the smell of soap and bread was gone, replaced by the rank odor of wood smoke, old grease, and the man who lived there. He stopped sweeping. He ate jerky, standing over the hearth. The cold that he had kept at bay for weeks flooded back in, settling into the logs, into his bones. He had built a wall of ice around himself when Eliza died, and Marion, with her soft hands and sad eyes, had breached it. She had torn it down. Now, she was gone, and he was left standing in the ruins, exposed and raw. He tried to go back to the man he was. He wrote his trap lines, his face a grim mask. But the land was different. It was just empty. It was no longer a harsh companion. It was just a place where she was not. Even the animals knew. Old Bone was listless, refusing the oats Silas offered. The little mare she had followed him on stood by the fence, staring south, waiting. Silas yelled at them, his voice a harsh rasp. But his anger had no heat. It was the anger of a hollow thing. He was a ghost in his own home. The cabin was a grave again. Marion and Tim walked for hours. She did not know where they were going. She just knew they had to move. Tim, sensing the terror in her, did not complain about the cold. He just held her hand, his small legs struggling to keep up. She followed the wagon tracks, the faint ruts in the snow that led, eventually, back to the stage line. It was the only sign of civilization. It was a 15-mile walk. They made it by nightfall, half dead, to a place called Dry Creek Station. It was not a town. It was a large, dirty stable, a bunkhouse for the drivers, and a main building that served as an eatery and a post. The station master, a man named Cobb, was thin and sour, his face stained with tobacco juice. "No room," he said, barely looking at her. "Stage ain't due for 2 days." "Please," Marion begged, pushing Tim forward. He's cold. I can work. I'll muck the stalls. I'll scrub your floors. Just a place out of the wind." Cobb looked at Tim, then at Marion. He saw a desperate woman. He saw free labor. He spat a stream of brown onto the snow. "Storage room, out back. There's a cot. You don't work. You don't stay." The room was a shed, cold and smelling of cured meats and mildew, but it had 4 walls and a roof. Marion worked. She scrubbed the filthy floor of the eatery, her hands, which had just begun to heal, splitting open again in the harsh lye water. She mucked stalls in the freezing barn. She was saving every scrap, trying to earn enough for a one-way ticket on the stage, anywhere, west, to a place where no one knew her name. She and Tim lived in the shadows for 3 days, but rumors travel faster than stagecoaches. On the 4th day, Sheriff Hatcher rode in from Blackwater, the next town over. He was a large man who liked his authority. He was not alone. One of Cyrus Vance's foremen rode with him. Marion was scrubbing the porch when they dismounted. The foreman pointed at her. "That's her, Sheriff. That's the one." Sheriff Hatcher hitched his belt. "Ma'am, you're Marion Fowler." Marion stood up slowly, her hands dripping gray water. I have a warrant for your arrest, from Blackwater, on the complaint of Mr. Cyrus Vance." "A warrant? For what?" she whispered, her blood running cold. "Vagrancy, lewd conduct, and theft," the sheriff said, pulling a paper from his pocket. "Says here you stole a silver locket from a Mr. Henderson on the wagon train. Mr. Vance is a witness." "That's a lie," Marion said, her voice shaking. There was no locket." "Tell it to the judge," Hatcher said, bored. He pulled out a pair of iron cuffs. "Mr. Vance has filed a formal complaint. He's concerned for your moral state. He's offered to oversee your redemption, pay your fine. Once the court settles it." Marion finally understood. This was not about justice. This was about possession. Cyrus could not buy her. He could not threaten her. So he would own her. He would redeem her by making her his property, a fallen woman under his righteous care, bound to him by a debt she could never repay. "No," she breathed, backing away. "You can't. Ma'am, don't make this difficult. They took her, Tim screamed, clinging to her. But the station master, Cobb, pulled him off, his face hard. He was not about to harbor a thief. Marion was cuffed and put on the back of the foreman's horse. "What about my boy?" she shrieked as they rode away. "He'll be sent to the orphanage in Cheyenne on the next stage," the sheriff called back. "Town's got no place for the children of your kind." Tim was left alone, locked in the storage room. He sat in the dark, his small body rigid with a terror he had never known. Hours later, he heard horses. He looked through a crack in the boards. It was Cyrus Vance, riding into the station, his fur coat making him look like a bear. He was laughing with Sheriff Hatcher, handing him a coin. The boy's terror turned into something else. It was the same pure, cold rage he had seen in Silas. He waited. He was small. The room had a loose board at the back, where animals had tried to get in. He worked at it with his fingers until it was wide enough to slip through. He crawled out into the darkness of the stable. The little mare, the one Marion had ridden, was still there. He couldn't reach the saddle. He didn't need it. He remembered Silas's hands, teaching him. You don't pull. You hold. You look at where you want to go. He climbed the stall gate, dropped onto the mare's back, and kicked her sides. The horse, startled, bolted from the open stable. He clung to her mane, a 9-year-old boy, riding bareback into the black, frozen night, riding for the only man he knew who could fight the monsters. Silas was in the barn. He was staring at the empty stall where the mare had been, his heart a cold, dead stone. He heard a sound, a horse, running too hard. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out. The little mare galloped into the yard and collapsed, her legs spent. A small shape tumbled from her back. It was Tim. The boy was half frozen, his face covered in ice, but his eyes were burning. He staggered to his feet and ran at Silas, beating his small fists against the man's heavy coat. "They took her!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "They took Marion! Mr. Cyrus! He lied! He put her in a jail! Silas! They're going to take her away!" The emptiness in Silas shattered. It was not a thaw. It was an explosion. A white-hot, singular purpose filled him. He swept the boy up in his arms, his grip like steel. "Where?" His voice was a low, terrifying growl. "Blackwater," Tim choked out. The courthouse. They said, in the morning. They said the judge is there." Silas carried the boy inside. He did not waste time. He sat Tim by the fire, wrapped him in every blanket, and put the coffee pot on. "You stay here, bar the door, eat." He went back out. He did not take the tired mare. He saddled Old Bone. The horse, sensing the change in his master, was alive again, his eyes wide, his ears forward. Silas checked his rifle. He checked the pistol on his hip. He mounted the horse. He did not wait for morning. He rode into the darkness. He rode all night, a 30-mile ride through snowdrifts and biting wind. He did not feel the cold. He was the storm. He arrived in Blackwater as the sun was casting its first weak, gray light. The town was bigger, with a 2-story courthouse. He tied Old Bone to the rail, the horse's flanks steaming. The courtroom was on the 2nd floor, above the land office. It was already packed. It was a spectacle. The good, church-going people of the county had come to see the whore get her judgment. Silas saw Cyrus first. He was sitting in the front row, dressed in his Sunday best, looking like a town elder, a smug, righteous pity on his face. Then he saw Marion. She was at a small table at the front. Alone, she was pale, her hair lank, her hands cuffed in her lap. She looked small, defeated, and utterly broken. A traveling judge, Elias Thorne, a man with a stern, joyless face, was presiding. "And this harlot," a voice was saying, "has been a blight on this territory, a vagrant, a thief, and a seductress." It was the preacher, Reverend Gideon. He was testifying to her character. "Thank you, Reverend," the judge said. "Mr. Vance, you have brought this complaint, and you have an offer, I believe." Cyrus stood up, clasping his hands. "Your Honor, I am a Christian man. I believe in redemption. I see here a woman, lost. I have spoken to Mr. Henderson, and he is a forgiving man. He does not wish to press the theft. He only wants his property returned." He was lying. The locket didn't exist. I will pay her fine. I will take her into my own home. I have work. She can work off her debt to society and to God under my supervision." The room murmured in approval. How generous. How Christian. Marion looked up, her eyes wide with a terror that was worse than death. She would be his slave. "Stop!" The voice cut through the room like an axe. Silas stood in the doorway. He was a terrifying sight. He was covered in ice and snow. His beard was wild, and his eyes were fixed on Cyrus, and they were the eyes of a wolf. The room went silent. Marion made a small sound, a half-sob, half-gasp. "Who are you, sir?" the judge demanded. "My name is Silas." He walked into the room, his boots heavy on the floor. He did not stop until he was standing beside Marion. "And you," he pointed at Cyrus, "are a liar." Cyrus's face went white. This is the man, Your Honor. This is the man who was harboring her. He's as lost as she is." "Is that true, sir?" the judge asked Silas. "Was this woman living with you?" Silas looked at the judge. He looked at the pale, whispering faces of the townsfolk. He looked at the preacher. Then he looked down at Marion. He reached out and, with one hand, gently touched her hair. "Yes," he said, his voice clear and carrying. "She was living with me, her and her brother. I took them in when they were freezing." "And in what capacity did she live?" the judge pressed. "This is a house of law," the preacher shouted. "He should not be allowed to—" "I'll speak," Silas boomed, silencing the room. He turned to the judge. "You want to know? You all want to know? She cooked my food. She cleaned my home. She mended my clothes. She saved my horse, and she saved me." He took a breath. "You call her a whore. You, Cyrus, you call her a thief. You, preacher, you call her unclean. You don't know her. You don't know the first thing about her. She's a widow. She lost her child to a fever. She was betrayed and cast out by men like you." He looked at Marion. "Yes, I lay with her. I slept with her. And I love her." The room exploded. Women gasped. Men muttered. Marion was staring at him, tears streaming down her face, her cuffed hands rising to her mouth. "I will not stand for this blasphemy," Reverend Gideon roared, standing up, his face purple. "This is a confession of sin. He admits to his base, carnal lust." "It ain't lust, preacher," Silas said, his voice quiet, but more dangerous than his shout. "It's love, something you, in your cold church, seem to know nothing about." He turned back to the judge. "She's not a vagrant. She has a home. With me, she's not a thief. She's the most honest person I've ever met. And if this court needs a piece of paper to make it right, then I'll marry her, right here, right now." He locked eyes with the preacher. "Reverend, do your job. Marry us." Reverend Gideon looked as if Silas had struck him. I will not. I will not profane the sanctity of marriage by joining a good man, perhaps, but one lost to temptation, to this unclean woman. She is a Jezebel. I will not perform the rites." The judge banged his gavel. "This is not a wedding chapel, Mr. Silas. This is a court of law. The testimony of her character is damning. The confession of your cohabitation only confirms her lewd conduct. I find the defendant, Marion Fowler, guilty of vagrancy and moral indecency." Before the judge could say another word, Silas moved. He walked past the sputtering preacher, He walked past the sheriff, who was too stunned to move. He walked right up to Marion's chair. She looked up at him, her eyes full of a love and a terror so bright it took his breath away. He did not ask, he did not speak. He bent down, slid one massive arm under her legs and the other behind her back. He lifted her as easily as he had carried Tim from the snow. Her cuffs clinked. "What is the meaning of this?" the judge yelled, standing up. "Sheriff, stop him! That is a prisoner of this court." The sheriff fumbled for his pistol. Silas turned, holding Marion tight against his chest. He stopped at the door. He looked at the whole, stunned, hateful room. He looked at the preacher. He looked at the judge. He looked at Cyrus, whose face was a mask of pure, astonished rage. "We don't need you," Silas said, his voice like granite. "We don't need your rules. We don't need your papers, or your judgment, or your God." He looked down at Marion. Her arms were locked around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. "You've been my wife since that first snowstorm," he said, his voice soft enough for only her to hear, but his gaze defiant to the room. "You were my wife when I was in your bed. You're my wife now, and there ain't a man in this territory, or a judge, or a preacher, who can say different." He kicked the door open and carried her down the stairs and out into the cold, bright morning. The entire town was on the street. Watching, he walked straight to Old Bone. He mounted the horse in one smooth, powerful movement, seating her in front of him. He did not look back. He kicked the horse into a trot, and they rode out of Blackwater. Marion turned, pressing her face against his chest, her small, cuffed hand finding his large, rough one. They rode west, into the snow, needing nothing but each other. They rode for 2 full days. They did not go back to the ranch. Silas knew instinctively that Cyrus would go there first, and he would not go there in peace. The man's pride was shattered, and he would answer with fire. Silas's home, the one he had built with his own hands, the one that held the ghosts of Eliza, was lost to him. He carried Marion on Old Bone, her cuffed hands resting on the saddle horn, her body leaning back against his chest. He had the key for the cuffs, taken from the sheriff's desk in the chaos, but he did not stop. He rode west, pushing deeper into the foothills, climbing above the prairie, toward the high country. This was a place Silas knew. It was a high, sheltered meadow, cupped in the hands of the mountains, with a spring that ran cold and clear, and a thick stand of pine that broke the wind. He had camped here once, years ago, and had thought it would make a good spring pasture, a place to move the horses when the lowlands flooded. He never dreamed it would be a refuge. They arrived with nothing: 1 rifle, 1 pistol, 2 horses, and the clothes on their backs. They were wanted by the law, hated by the town, and had no shelter against the coming night. The first thing Silas did was stop. He dismounted, lifted Marion down, and stood her on the snow-covered grass. He looked at her, his face grim in the fading light. Then he took the key from his pocket and unlocked the iron cuffs. They fell away, leaving her wrists raw and red. Marion did not rub them. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his. He had saved her. He had claimed her. He had lost everything for her. "Silas," she whispered, her voice rough. "Your home, your ranch." "It was just wood," he said, his voice flat. "It's gone." He tossed the cuffs into a deep snowdrift, burying them. "This is home now, if we can make it." That first night, they slept in a crude shelter he built against a rock face, using fallen pine boughs as a roof and a large, roaring fire as a wall. He gave her his coat, and he sat awake, the rifle across his knees, listening to the wolves, which sounded closer here, and the wind, which sang a different song in the high pines. The next morning, the work began. They were not building a shelter. They were building a life, from scratch, with the land as their only resource and the winter as their only clock. Silas took his axe. We need a cabin before the spring thaw brings the patrols. Marion nodded. She was not the weak woman who had stumbled to his door. She had been forged. What do I do? He looked at his axe, then at her. He handed her his skinning knife. Trim the branches, every bough you can find. We'll need them for the roof, for the floor. They worked. Silas felled the trees, his swings precise and powerful. He was not clearing land. He was choosing each log, measuring it with his eye. It was brutal, exhausting work. Marion, her hands wrapped in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat, dragged the smaller logs, trimmed branches, and began stripping the bark with a small knife. Her hands, which had once been so soft, were now a map of her life, cracked, scarred, but strong. They worked from the first gray light until they could not see their hands in the darkness. They ate the last of the jerky Silas had in his saddlebags. He shot a rabbit, and she stewed it in the tin coffee pot. It took 3 weeks, 3 weeks of relentless, back-breaking labor. They built a small, tight cabin, not much bigger than a line shack, digging it back into the hillside for warmth. They chinked the logs with mud and moss. They built a fireplace from river stones, Marion hauling them one by one in her apron until her back screamed. While Silas finished the roof, Marion dug. She had seen where the springs seeped from the ground. She knew they needed a well, a protected source, closer to the cabin. She dug in the half-frozen ground with a sharpened piece of wood and her bare hands, day after day, until her fingers bled. When she finally hit clear, cold water, she sat back and wept, not from pain, but from triumph. They acquired, Silas rode out, a shadow in the hills, and came back. One day, he returned with Tim. He had ridden the 20 miles back to the ranch under the cover of a snowstorm. The cabin was a smoking ruin, just as he'd thought. Cyrus had been thorough, but in the barn, which was only half burnt, he had found the little mare, waiting faithfully, and he found Tim. The boy had made his way back, following the mare, and was hiding in the root cellar, cold and terrified, but alive. When Marion saw her brother, she collapsed. Silas caught her, holding her and the boy as they cried, the first tears she had allowed herself since the trial. The boy was changed. He was quiet, his eyes holding the shadows of what he had seen. But the high, clean air, and the work, and the safety began to heal him. He followed Silas everywhere, a small, devoted shadow. He stopped calling him Silas. One morning, when Silas was showing him how to split wood, the boy asked, "Pa, am I doing it right?" Silas froze. He looked at the boy, at his small hand struggling with the hatchet. He put his own large hand over Tim's, guiding the swing. "You are, son, straight and true." The family settled. Silas taught Tim to track, to read the snow, to know which way the wind was blowing. He began to teach him how to work leather, using the hides from the animals he trapped. He started, with patience, to tool a small saddle, just the right size for the boy. Marion planted. She had found, miraculously, a half-burnt sack of potatoes in the root cellar. She cut the eyes from them and planted them in the small patch of earth she and Tim had cleared, praying they would take. She gathered wild herbs. She made their small cabin a home. It was warmer than the old one. It was filled, not with ghosts, but with a quiet, stubborn life. Silas had managed to save one more thing from the ruin, a pregnant mare, Old Bones' mate, who had been hiding in a far gully. In the early spring, as the snows melted, the mare foaled. It was a good birth, a strong-legged filly, and it felt like a promise, a sign from God, or the land, that life would continue. They were poor, they were outcasts. They were, perhaps, the 3 happiest people in the Wyoming Territory. Then the thaw came in earnest. The winter had been too long, the snow too deep. The melt came all at once, a rush of water and ice. The high spring that fed their well became a torrent. The dry meadow below their cabin turned into a shallow, fast-moving lake. The sound woke them in the middle of the night, a low, grinding roar. It was not thunder. It was the sound of the earth moving. "The barn," Silas said, pulling on his boots. He had built a small, crude structure for the horses and the handful of chickens he'd managed to trade skins for in a distant, friendly Shoshone camp. It was built lower down, near the pasture. He grabbed his lantern and ran out. Marion and Tim were right behind him. The creek had jumped its banks. It was a churning brown river, full of ice and debris, and it was tearing through the small barn. The horses, neighing in terror, were struggling in chest-deep, freezing water. "Get the horses, Pa!" Tim shouted. Silas waded in, the water instantly soaking him, the current pulling at his legs. He grabbed Old Bones' rope. "Marion, get back! The whole thing is coming down!" But Marion had seen the small chicken coop, which had been swept against the far wall. The chickens were their future. They were her eggs, her food. "The hens!" she cried. "Leave them!" Silas roared, fighting to get Old Bone untied. She didn't listen. She was a homesteader now. You didn't leave assets. She waded into the swirling water, which came up to her waist, fighting her way toward the coop. Just as she reached it, the main support beam of the barn, weakened by the water, groaned. "Marion!" Silas screamed. The roof gave way. A mass of heavy, waterlogged timbers and sod collapsed right where she was standing, driving her under the brown, icy water. There was no thought. There was only a roar that came from deep in Silas's chest. He let go of the horse. He dove into the water, digging with his bare hands at the timbers. The debris. He could not see. He could only feel. He felt her skirt, then her arm. He pulled, bracing his feet against a submerged log, his muscles screaming. He dragged her free and hauled her back to the bank, throwing her onto the wet grass. She was not breathing. She was blue, her face slick with mud. "No," he whispered. "No, not you. I won't let you." He turned her over, striking her back, forcing the water from her lungs. She choked, a terrible, rasping sound. He turned her back and pressed his mouth to hers, breathing his own air, his own life, into her. "Breathe, Marion," he commanded, his voice breaking. "Breathe, damn you. Breathe for me." She gasped, a sudden, violent intake of air. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and terrified. She choked, spat out muddy water, and then seized him, clinging to him, her body shaking with a cold so deep it felt like death. He did not let her go. He just knelt there in the mud, in the center of the flood, holding her, his face buried in her wet hair. He kissed her, not with passion, but with a raw, desperate relief that was more intimate than any touch. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her mouth, his own tears mixing with the floodwater on her face. He had lost one woman to the elements. He would not lose another. He carried her back to the cabin. Tim, who had managed to get the horses to high ground, was already there, his face white, building the fire up to a roar. Silas stripped her wet, muddy clothes from her body, his hands shaking. He wrapped her in every dry blanket they owned and set her by the fire. He sat behind her, pulling her back against his chest, sharing his own body heat, rubbing her arms and legs, forcing the life back into her. He held her like that for hours, until the shaking stopped, until her skin turned from blue to pale, and then to pink. That night, the flood receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud and ruin. The barn was gone. The chickens were gone, but they were alive. Tim was asleep on his pallet, exhausted. Silas sat on the floor, staring into the flames. Marion, wrapped in a blanket, came to sit beside him. She did not speak. She just laid her head on his shoulder. He looked at her. He saw the strength that had made her run into the water. He saw the woman who had dug a well with her hands. He saw the wife who had built this home with him. He touched her face. "You fool," he whispered. "They were just chickens."
They were ours.
She whispered back, her voice still hoarsome. He kissed her. This time, it was slow. It was the kiss he had wanted to give her that morning, before Tim had seen them. It was a kiss of gratitude, and of a love so deep it ached. They moved to the cot, their shared bed. He unwrapped the blanket. She was still cold. He lay beside her, pulling the heavy furs over them both, and warmed her with his own body. They made love by the light of the fire. It was not the desperate, angry coupling in the barn. It was not the hurried, possessive claim after the fight. It was slow and deep and trembling with emotion. It was the touch of two people who had almost lost everything. Again, it was the act of two souls, the last two souls on earth, finally finding a safe harbor in each other. They moved together with a reverence, a quiet desperation to map every inch of the other, to confirm that they were both still here, still whole, still alive. After they lay tangled, the firelight playing over their skin, Marion traced the line of his jaw, the rough beard, the scar on his cheek.
I don't need promises, Silas,
she said, her voice quiet in the small, warm cabin. I don't need a preacher or a judge. I just need to wake up tomorrow and see you here. Silas closed his eyes. His heart, which he had thought was a dead thing, feeling so full it might burst. He kissed her hand. I'll be here, he promised. I'm not going anywhere, ever. The next day, the sun was shining. The world felt washed clean. Silas went out to survey the damage. The mud was deep, but the cabin had held. The horses were safe. They had lost the barn, but they had not lost each other. He went to his small forge, a crude thing he had built with rocks and a salvaged bellows. He found an old, bent horseshoe nail in the mud, a remnant from the old mare. He heated it in the coals, hammering it on a flat stone, shaping it, bending it, working the iron until it was no longer a nail, but a small, imperfect circle. He went back to the cabin. Marion was asleep, her body finally given in to exhaustion. He found her mending basket. He took a pair of scissors and cut a tiny strip of cloth from the sleeve of her oldest dress, the faded blue calico she had been wearing when she first arrived. He carefully wrapped the thin strip of cloth around the iron ring, over and over, until the metal was covered. It was not gold, it was not silver, it was iron and cloth and mud. It was the strongest, most beautiful thing he had ever made. He slipped it onto her finger while she slept. He went back outside. His heart settled. He was a husband. He was a father. This was his home. He was so focused on the new filly, checking her legs in the bright sunlight, that he did not hear them at first. It was Tim who saw them. "Pa," the boy said, his voice high and tight. "Pa, riders." Silas looked up. They were on the ridge above the meadow. 6 of them. They were not lawmen. They were hard-looking men with rifles across their saddles. And at their lead, on his fine black horse, wearing his beaver fur coat, was Cyrus Vance. He had found them. Cyrus raised a hand, not in greeting, but in command. "Mr. Silas," his voice echoed across the meadow, oily and triumphant. "A beautiful spot you've chosen. Unfortunately, it's not yours." He unrolled a piece of paper, a map. "According to the surveyor's office in Cheyenne, this entire section, including your little spring, was filed under the Homestead Act by me 2 weeks ago. You are, I'm afraid, trespassing." Silas looked at the paper in Cyrus's hand. He looked at the 6 armed men, their faces hard and indifferent, their rifles resting easy across their saddles. They were not lawmen. They were hired guns. "Tim," Silas said, his voice low and steady. He did not look away from Cyrus. "Take Marion. Go inside the cabin. Bar the door. Stay low, and stay away from the window."
"Silas, no,"
Marion whispered, her hand grabbing his arm.
"We can leave. It's just land."
"It's not the land," Silas said. He looked at her then, his eyes clear. "It's our home. Go, now." She saw the finality in his face. She grabbed Tim's hand and ran, pulling the boy into the small, sturdy cabin. The heavy wooden bar slammed into place. Silas turned his full attention back to Cyrus.
"You filed a claim 2 weeks ago? I've been on this land for 4 years. My improvements, my cabin, my first wife is buried on that hill. This claim is mine by right."
"Your improvements?" Cyrus laughed, a high, ugly sound. He gestured to the smoking ruin of Silas's old ranch in the valley below them. "My reports say your improvements. Burned down. Tragic. And you, by all accounts, fled the law. You're a fugitive, Silas, a squatter. Now, I'm giving you one chance. Take your whore and your boy, and ride out, or I'll have my men clear this land, and you with it." Silas let out a slow breath. He was one man against 6. He had his rifle. He had the pistol on his hip. He had the rocks in the cabin at his back. "This is your last warning, Vance," Silas said, his voice carrying on the clear mountain air. "You're the one who's trespassing. Turn that horse around." Cyrus's face turned dark. "Fools! You could have just run." He nodded to his men. "He's resisting. Clear the land." The man to Cyrus's right, a heavy-set man named Cully, raised his rifle. Silas did not wait. He was not a fool. He was a homesteader. He dove sideways behind the large boulder that formed one corner of his forge. The world exploded. A volley of 6 shots ripped through the air where he had been standing. Bullets thudded into the logs of the cabin, one whining through the small window, shattering the glass Marion had so carefully installed. He heard her scream. Cut short. "Spread out!" Cyrus yelled. "Flank him! Burn him out!" Silas rested his Winchester on the boulder. He was calm. This was not a bar fight. This was a hunt. He aimed, not at Cyrus, who stayed back, but at Cully, the most aggressive. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. Cully cried out, grabbing his shoulder, and fell from his horse. He was not dead, but he was out of the fight. "Move!" Cyrus shrieked. His voice panicked. 2 men dismounted, running for the cover of the trees. 2 others rode hard toward the ruined barn, trying to get a crossfire. Silas fired again, forcing the riders back. He reloaded, the brass casings hot against his cold fingers. He was pinned. "Silas!" It was Marion. She was at the window, not the broken one, but the small slit he used for ventilation. She was holding his other rifle, the old Spencer. "Stay down!" he roared. "They're in the trees, to your left." A shot kicked up dirt near his boot. He pulled back. Another bullet slammed into the boulder, sending stone fragments into his cheek. He wiped the blood away. He was trapped. One of the men who had dismounted, a younger man, Cully's brother, saw his chance. He thought Silas was distracted. He broke cover, running low, trying to get behind the forge, his pistol raised. Silas saw him. He dropped the rifle and drew his pistol. The man was fast. He fired. The bullet was a line of pure, white heat. It hit Silas in the ribs, staggering him, knocking the breath from his lungs. He fell back against the rock, sliding down. "He's hit!" the young man screamed, a cry of triumph. He slowed, raising his pistol for the kill shot. His face split in a grin. Silas, playing possum, raised his own pistol from the ground. His vision was graying, but his hand was steady. He fired once. The man's grin vanished. His eyes went wide. He looked down at the red, spreading stain on his chest, then fell, face first, into the mud. There was a terrible, echoing silence. "Ben!" Cully screamed from where he lay on the ground, holding his shoulder. "Ben!" "Get him!" Cyrus roared at the other men. But the fight had changed. The hired guns had signed on for intimidation, maybe even a quick, one-sided fight. They had not signed on to be picked off, one, by a ghost on a mountain. They had not signed on to die.
One of the men in the trees fired, wildly, then mounted his horse.
"He ain't worth it. Cyrus, he killed Ben." "Get back here, you cowards!" Cyrus shrieked. But the retreat had begun. The two men who had flanked the barn wheeled their horses. They galloped back, scooped up the wounded Cully, and threw him over his saddle. The other man in the trees was already gone. Cyrus was left alone, his fine black horse prancing in fear. He looked at Silas, who was struggling to his feet, pistol still in his hand, his side soaked in blood. He looked at the cabin, where Marion now had her rifle trained directly on his chest. Cyrus Vance was a wealthy man. He was a bully. He was not a brave man. His face, a mask of pure, astonished hatred, contorted. He pulled his horse around so hard the animal reared. "This ain't over, Silas. You'll hang for this. You'll hang for murder." He kicked his horse and fled down the mountain, his men scattering before him. The silence that fell was profound. It was just the wind in the pines and the sound of Silas's ragged breathing. Marion was out the door in a second, Tim right behind her. "Silas!" He waved her off, but his legs gave way. He sat hard, on the ground, the pistol falling from his numb fingers. "The horses," he gasped, the words tight with pain. They'll be scattered." "To hell with the horses," Marion said, dropping to her knees beside him. She ripped his shirt open. The bullet had gone clean, but it had torn a long, ragged gash along his ribs. It was deep. It was bleeding badly. "Tim," she said, her voice sharp, but calm. "Get the whiskey from the box. Get the clean rags. Get the needle and the gut thread. Go!" The boy, his face white, did not hesitate. He ran. Marion pressed her hands to the wound, trying to staunch the blood. "You fool," she whispered, her voice thick with tears she would not shed. "You stubborn, brave fool." "Had to," he managed, his head falling back against the rock. "It's home." She half dragged, half carried him into the cabin. She laid him on their cot. For the next 2 hours, she was a surgeon. Her soft hands, now calloused and strong, were steady. She cleaned the wound with the burning whiskey. He did not cry out, but his body went rigid. She stitched the torn flesh, her movements small and precise, just as she had stitched his shirts. When it was done, he was pale, and the fever was already beginning. He was weak, drifting in and out of consciousness. Night fell. The cabin was a fortress. Tim, his face still pale but set with a grim determination, reloaded the rifle Silas had dropped. He sat on his pallet, watching the door. Marion pulled the heavy chair to the broken window, tacking a blanket over it. She took the Spencer. "Tim," she said, "go to sleep." "I can help," the boy said, his voice a man's. "I know," she said, touching his hair. "But I need you rested, in case they come back. I'll take the first watch." Tim finally lay down, the rifle clutched to his chest, and fell into an exhausted sleep. Marion sat in the darkness. The only sounds were the wind, the crackle of the fire, and Silas's low, fevered breathing. She held the heavy rifle, its cold steel a comfort in her hands. She looked at her hands, gripped around the wooden stock. These were not the hands of a victim. They were not the hands of a woman who had begged a man to pretend to love her. They were the hands that had built a home, dug a well, stitched a man's life back together, and now they held the line. She thought of her life before. She had been passed from her father, to her husband, to the mercy of men like Henderson, and the cruelty of men like Cyrus. Her body, her presence, was the only thing she had. It was a currency and a curse. Tonight, she was worth more than that. She was the guardian of her family. She was the protector of the man she loved. If Cyrus and his men came back, they would not find a weeping widow. They would find a woman of Wyoming. They would find her waiting. She sat there all night, her back straight, the rifle across her lap. She was not afraid. For the first time in her entire life, she felt truly, completely whole. They did not come back. Cyrus's plan had shattered. The man Silas had killed, Ben, was the younger brother of his foreman, Cully. When they got back to Blackwater, Cully, half mad with grief and his own wound, did not stay silent. He got drunk, and he talked. He told everyone how Cyrus had lied, how he had faked the land claim, and how he had led them into an ambush to murder a homesteader and his family. Cyrus tried to have him arrested for slander, but the story was too big, and Cully, it turned out, had kept records. He had the fake, backdated claim papers Cyrus had given him. He had letters promising payment. When the federal marshal from Cheyenne finally rode into Blackwater, he was not there to arrest Silas. He was there to arrest Cyrus Vance. The trial was a sensation. It was held in Cheyenne, and the entire territory was watching. Silas, his side bandaged, his arm in a sling, rode in. He did not ride in as a prisoner. He rode in as a witness. He and Marion walked into the courtroom together. The townsfolk, the same ones who had whispered and sneered, parted for them. They saw him, a man who had fought 6 men to protect his home, and they saw her, not as a harlot, but as the woman who had stood by him, the woman who had stitched him up, the woman who had held a rifle all night in his defense. Cully, his arm in a sling, testified. He told the truth. He told them about the wagon train, about the lie Cyrus had started, about the fake locket, all because Marion had refused him. He told them about the plan to burn Silas out, to steal his land, to murder his family. The verdict was swift. Cyrus Vance was found guilty of conspiracy, land fraud, and incitement to murder. His wealth could not save him. He was ruined. The marshal approached Silas outside the courthouse. "Mr. Silas," he said, touching his hat, "the court has reviewed your claim, your original homestead, and the new one in the mountains. The land is yours. Sir, free and clear." He turned to Marion. "Ma'am, on behalf of the territory, I apologize. Your name is cleared, fully vindicated." Marion just nodded, her eyes bright, and tightened her grip on Silas's good arm. They rode back to the mountain. The town of Blackwater had offered them a room, a free meal. The preacher, Reverend Gideon, had come to them, his face pale, offering a formal apology, offering to sanctify their union in the eyes of God. Silas had looked at the man, then at Marion. "We don't need your blessing. Prior, we've had God's. He gave us the mountain." They were married a week later, when the last of the spring flowers were in bloom. There was no church, there was no preacher, there was no paper. They stood under the largest pine tree on the meadow, the one that had sheltered them. The wind was the only hymn. The dried flowers Marion had gathered were her bouquet. Tim, his face clean, his hair combed, stood as the witness. Silas wore his clean work clothes. He took her hands. They were calloused, like his. He looked into her eyes. "Marion," he said, his voice rough, "before you, I was empty. This land was just a place to die. You and the boy, you made it a home. You are my heart. You are my strength. You are my wife. Before this mountain and before God, I am your man." Marion felt the tears, the good tears, finally come. "Silas, you took me in when I was cold. You fought for me when I was accused. You saw me when I was nothing. You gave me a family. You gave me a life. You are my home. I am your woman. I will be your wife, all the days of my life." He smiled, a slow, real smile. He took her left hand and slid the ring onto her finger, the small, imperfect circle of hammered iron, wrapped in the faded blue cloth from her old dress. She looked at it. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She lifted her face, and he kissed her. It was a kiss of promise, of peace,
of a life built not on pretending, but on surviving. Tim ran to them, and they both wrapped their arms around him. The three of them stood there. A family, a man, a woman, and a boy. A house made of logs, a life made of love, and a home built on tears and iron. That night they sat by the fire. The cabin was warm. Tim was asleep. The wind was high, but it was just the wind. Marion sat, leaning her head on Silas's good shoulder, twisting the new, rough ring on her finger. It felt permanent. "Silas," she whispered. He grunted, content, watching the flames. "Do you remember, in the old cabin, in the barn?" He turned his head, his eyes finding hers. He remembered. "I asked you to pretend," she said, her voice soft. "I was so lost. I asked you to pretend you loved me. I just wanted to know what it felt like, even for a moment." He didn't speak. He just watched her. She smiled, a slow, true smile that lit her eyes from within. She touched his rough-bearded cheek. "I don't need to ask you that anymore," she said. "I don't need to pretend." She leaned in and kissed him, a soft, sure kiss. "Because I know you love me for real." Thank you so much for listening to our story from Wild West. We truly hope you enjoyed it. We would love to hear from you. So please, leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Let's connect. And if you liked this story, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts.